Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jules Scarlett, and I'm Telstra's Government, Regional Affairs and Sustainability Executive. And thank you for joining us today. I am absolutely thrilled with the amount of interest that has been shown in relation to the launch today of the latest Digital Inclusion Index. And that's shown by the numbers still increasing in terms of people joining this virtual call today. I'm very proudly joining to you today from Tasmania, which is Lutruwata, and I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of the land, the Padarama people. And on behalf of Telstra, I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, from wherever you are joining today. We recognise their continuing connection to land, to water and culture, and we pay our respect to the elders past, present and emerging. I've been so excited to get to the session of being able to launch today the Digital Inclusion Index for 2020. And we have some great speakers today to help bring you closer to the information in that and why we think it's really important. So I'd like to extend a special welcome to our researchers. We have Professor Julian Thomas from RMIT, who led the research team, and Professor Joe Barraket and Dr. Chris Wilson, who are both from the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne. I'd also like to extend a welcome to Michelle Levine from Roy Morgan and the rest of the Roy Morgan team, along with our really sincere thanks. This is the last year that the index will be powered by Roy Morgan, and I wanted to have a special call out because Roy Morgan has provided data for the index since 2016, and we thank them for their contribution. I'd also like to welcome Andy Penn, who is the CEO of Telstra, and we'll also be asking Andy for his perspectives on why digital inclusion is important in this age of digitisation. Launching this 2020 Digital Inclusion Index report virtually this year is almost putting a showcase onto the aspect of inclusion itself. It really highlights the increasing role that digital has taken in all of our lives. But on the one hand, it has meant that people from all over Australia can participate today, and that includes me dialing in from Tasmania. But it also highlights a more poignant point that connectivity isn't the only thing that you need for digital inclusion. And in fact, what we'll be talking about today is aspects of access, but also affordability and digital ability. All those things are really important when you think about digital inclusion. This is the 5th Digital Inclusion Index report, and it incorporates data from 2014 through to March this year. Now, I have March this year firmly embedded in my mind because that's the date where at Telstra we had over 25,000 staff in mid-March went to working at home. But what it does mean in relation to the index this year is it doesn't reflect the full impact of the pandemic on Australia's digital inclusion. So what we've done instead is, in terms of the actual documentation, we've included some case studies to help highlight what actually the impacts are, to provide insight into the COVID impacts. But you will find that when we release further information on digital inclusion in terms of data, that will bring us up to speed in relation to COVID impacts. But do have a look out for some of the impacts on those specific groups most impacted, including low-income families and older Australians. So this afternoon, we're going to hear from Andy on digitisation, digital inclusion, and how that links to a concept we've been talking more about, which is responsible business. Julian will then give an overview of the 2020 findings, and we'll conclude with what I think is like one of the really exciting parts of it, which is the Q&A, where each of our researchers, Julian and Joe and Chris, will be available along with us all to help to really have a more interactive part of the conversation. So please leave your video on, because that's great for those who want to look at the gallery shot to see just the myriad of people who have joined and are interested in this conversation today. But do have your sound muted. And I do notice in the chat that there's a bit of an echo for some, so that'd be great in terms of putting that to make it so that there's less echo if possible. Just for those, if you'd like to change your view, you can yourself change your view from speaker view to gallery view, and it's generally at the top right of your screen. So a bit more on the admin. The chat is on the right-hand side, the feed. If you want to use the button down the bottom to switch your chat on and then track that, please feel free to enter anytime. I'm glad to see that people are talking about where they're dialing in from on country as well, and also that the echo seems better. If you've got any technical problems with the webinar, we do have Rhonda from CSI, our moderator, is here to help. So just reach out to her in the chat. So let's get underway to leave as much time as well for questions and the important parts of talking about why digital inclusion is important. So Andy, I'd love to start with you, and I'd like to welcome you and also just hand to you to share with us your views on what's been happening with digitisation and why that is important, and then how that relates to both digital inclusion, what we're here to talk about today, as well as the concept of responsible business.
Hey, thanks so much, Jules, and apologies for the echo. I think that may have been me. I wasn't on mute because I knew I was speaking and I wasn't sure where the mute was being controlled from. So my apologies, everybody. And I'm coming to you from the Kulin Nation, and would pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And it is exciting. And I'm incredibly proud, like Jules is, to be launching this Australian Digital Inclusion Index for the 5th time this year. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Julian a little bit later on, who's going to take us through some of the key findings. But can I also thank the other researchers, Joe from Swinburne University, the support of Roy Morgan, Michelle Levine. Thank you very much to you, and also to Julian from RMIT for the great work that you've done as well. And it really is an important piece of work. And my word, what a year 2020 has been for all of us and turned out to be. And if you'll excuse my dogs barking in the background, it's one of the things from working from home. But what a year it's turned out to be. And I sincerely hope all of you are safe and healthy, and your families are safe and healthy, and you're feeling supported, because it really has had a very significant impact. And of course, what it has done is brought into stark focus, I guess, the importance of the digital economy and digitisation. I've spoken in a number of forums and spoken about how, we've seen more digital adoption in, just the last sort of 4 or 5 months or so than we have in the previous 4 or 5 years, which is fascinating to watch. And maybe to put some numbers behind that, in our telecommunications networks, as an example, we saw peak data speeds increase by more than 70% at the height of the pandemic. We've seen a 50% increase in what we call upload speeds. Normally, when you're doing working on the internet, you're downloading a lot of things, but upload becomes more important when you're doing things like video. We've seen something like a 500% increase in video traffic among Telstra. I mean, we have somewhere in the region of 8 million Microsoft Teams calls every month. That's up 500%. So it's been incredible, and in many ways it's a good thing, because I also think it's enabled a lot of businesses and a lot of organisations to cope with the implications of COVID, and more importantly, the restrictions that have been imposed as a consequence of COVID, more so than they might ever have been able to do. I mean, interestingly, in retail, we've seen in-store sales across the retail sector down by more than 20%, but overall only down by 7%, because e-commerce sales are up very materially. And if you just think, even 10 years ago, we probably as a society would not have been able to respond to such an impact just because we wouldn't have had the technology. And that's one of the things I think about when I say that we've seen more digital adoption in the last few months than in the previous 5 years. One of the things that says to you is that technology wasn't actually the constraint, because if it was, we wouldn't have been able to adopt it so quickly, because you can't build it that quickly. And so what it means is that we've become much more adept at adopting it as well. And so that's been critically important. And then, of course, I think the other thing that we've seen is how important it's going to be to a fast recovery economically from COVID. We've done our own research that says that if Australia can really accelerate towards the Prime Minister's aspiration of being a leading digital economy by 2030, that could add almost $90 billion of additional GDP. And what comes with that is somewhere in the order of 250,000 jobs. And that's really important. And the interesting thing about those jobs as well, by the way, is that they're not all necessarily IT jobs or engineering jobs. I mean, for example, in logistics, because of the increase in e-commerce, we see that there's capacity for a further 15,000 jobs in logistics. Also in healthcare, by using digital technologies to improve the efficiency of the back end and the administration of processes in healthcare system, which is relatively inefficient. Still a lot of paperwork happening in hospitals and in other health services. What that does is free up resources for more frontline workers, which is fantastic as well. So, you know, so many good things that can come out of a digital economy. But one of the observations that I would have is that, you know, at periods of time when we do see significant leaps forward in technological advancement, which more broadly tend to be advantageous, the issue is that what tends to be the case is that those that can least afford to be left behind are in fact left behind, and the digital divide and these gaps become bigger, not smaller. And that's why this digital inclusion index is very important, because, and particularly at this time, because we've been tracking this for 5 years, but what it does is it gives us an empirical research base of data with which to track what's really happening. And we look at it on 3 dimensions, and Julian will talk about this in a bit more detail, but we look at it from the perspective of availability. So do I just have internet coverage in my area? So if I live in regional remote, I may not even have access, I may not have coverage. Or secondly, is it affordable? Can I afford it? And then thirdly, how accessible it is. Do I have the digital skills with which to engage in it? And what you'll see is that in many respects, the results tend to follow the same sort of socioeconomic contours of society more generally. And those that, as I say, can least afford not to have this support don't have it, or don't have the same degree of digital inclusion. And that's the fundamental point. And of course, you know, as we saw earlier in the year, even with government services, so you know, we saw a very significant increase in inquiries into Services Australia, which looks after Medicare and looks after Centrelink. It's one of our most major customers. They saw a significant ramp up in the level of inquiries as people were looking for support, particularly as the government introduced new services such as JobKeeper and JobSeeker. But as you can imagine, during that time, the only way really to access those services was digitally. And of course, therefore, if the people that need those services aren't included in the digital economy, then they're not going to be able to access them. And that's a really important point. And so I think finally what I would say is that what's important about this research information is it is empirical evidence. And whilst we all know this conceptually and we all have anecdotes, ultimately when it comes to decision makers and governments, federal or state, making decisions about the allocation of resources to programs to help address digital inclusion, they're going to want to have real hard empirical evidence, particularly evidence which is captured over time. And that's the role that the Digital Inclusion Index plays. And I think my last comment would be that, you know, as we sit here on the dawn of the 2020s, I'm not sure that any of us predicted that this would be how the world would play out this year. But I do reflect when I was sort of as we came to the end of 2019, that, you know, business, particularly big business and its social license with the communities in which it supported and operated, I think had reached a bit of a low point, particularly off the back of the Royal Banking Commission. And I don't therefore put it all at the doorstep of the banks. But my point was, I think that society had lost trust in big business, and that relationship had probably reached a low point at the end of the 2010s. And I think the 2020s are an opportunity to rebuild that by thinking about how we do business differently and how we do business responsibly. I know at Telstra we're not perfect. We don't get it right all of the time, but understanding the importance of digital inclusion and this supporting this research is just one way in which we can try and make sure that we are threading the needle between, you know, meeting our responsibilities to our owners, our shareholders, but supporting the communities which we service and the customers that we service by really understanding where the gaps are. So, look, thank you so much, Jules, for the opportunity to speak. And I might hand over to Julian, who has really been instrumental in the research, to take you through the this year's results in a little bit more detail. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Andy. So as I said, Julian, we're right to go now in relation to you providing us with that overview of this year's results and drawing out for us what are some of the key takeouts.
Thanks, Jules, and it's a pleasure to do this. Thanks for the context you provided earlier, and thanks, Andy, as well. I think those comments are right to the point. I don't think we've done this work at any time over this whole period with more of a sense of its urgency and importance owing to the situations that we find ourselves in. Thanks also, I wanted to say, to our partners, to Telstra, for supporting the work, our colleagues and partners in Roy Morgan and the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne, colleagues and partners there who've supported this project for quite a while now, and we're starting to see some really significant outcomes, I think. So what I wanted to do today is, well, tell you a little bit about how we put this index together, so you know what it is we're talking about when we use these sorts of numbers and when we're suggesting that it's useful evidence, but also to of course give you a run through what we see as the main findings from our most recent research. So I'm just trying to move the slide on. There we are. So as we've said, what we're now reporting on is over 7 years of data going back to 2014 and going right through to 2020, so we can start to see some long-term trends. I think there's a few really significant things about it. What we're trying to do is produce a clear picture of digital inclusion in Australia. As Andy said, an evidence base, because that's particularly useful for governments, for business and for community organisations which are trying to decide where to put scarce resources in this area. We're hoping that we can usefully inform public debate, public policy discussions about different kinds of interventions. The work we've done, I think, has a couple of important elements to it. It's longitudinal, as I've said. We've now got 7 years of data, so we can start to sort of talk about trends in an interesting way. But it also gives us some geographical and regional coverage, so we can compare. The index enables us to compare outcomes in digital inclusion across the country. That's really significant. The last element, of course, is that we can do that for different groups of people. So we can track how Australia as a whole is going in terms of the development of digital inclusion over time, but we can also see what the differences are according to where you live or who you are, and that, of course, is really important. So, as Andy said, we look at digital inclusion in terms of three essential dimensions. It's a complex problem, so there's no single measure. We look at a few different things. Access is very important. That's about where and how often people are able to connect. Affordability is often overlooked. That's critical too. What proportion of your income are you spending on this? And digital ability, we think, is really important as well. It's one thing to to be able to connect and to have a plan, but what can you do with it? How much confidence or capability do people have? In the past, we feel as though too much of the debate in Australia has probably been about the access side, about what sort of service are people actually able to connect through. These other elements we think are just as important. So before I go through to the findings, let's just say a little bit more about each of those three dimensions. They're all made up themselves of components which we put together to form the index. So in terms of access, yeah, we're looking at how do people access the internet, how often do they do it, what sorts of places do they do it in, and what sorts of devices they've got, what are the kinds of range of connections they have. One really important element to all of this is how much data they have, because of course that's critical as well in terms of thinking about how much you can do online. When we think about affordability, we're really thinking about a couple of things, not just how much does your data cost, but very importantly, what proportion of your household income is going towards that, because we find, and I think you'll see this, that varies very significantly, as you'd expect, for different groups. The last of our three dimensions of inclusion is digital ability. This is also absolutely critical. As I said, it's all about confidence and capacity. What can people actually do online? What sorts of basic skills do they have? And that issue of attitude as well, their sense of control or not over what they're able to do online. And understanding more about those sorts of barriers is just as important as getting at how much data have people got or what sort of connection they might have. So they're the three key elements of the index. They're the things we measure. We put all of those things together to generate a score out of 100 for the country as a whole, for the different states and territories, for different regions, and of course for different social groups. It's not the number itself that means a great deal, but in comparison with others, we can see important trends and differences. And that's really what we're all about. So, as I said, one of the benefits of the work, of the approach we've taken, is that we can see how this tracks over time. And you can see here how, when we look at those three dimensions that we've been talking about, access, affordability, and digital ability, how have they tracked over time? You can see that overall digital inclusion's improved, but it hasn't improved evenly across those three dimensions. Some of the biggest gains over time have come from improvements in our access to the internet. That's to do with network infrastructure, obviously big things like the NBN and investment in mobile network infrastructure, but it's also to do with the proliferation of devices in the household and the workplace and so on. So you can see that that's increased very considerably since our data begins in 2014. But you can see also that it's starting to flatten out. So the big improvements are a bit behind us now, and what we're starting to see is a little bit of plateauing. So then when we look at the other key elements, it's also a story of improvement, but very gradual. You can see that digital ability, coming off a pretty low base, is gradually improving. That's good to see, but we want to see that distributed across the whole population. Affordability's a really mixed story. You can see really that we're not that much further ahead now than we were in 2014. It's improved marginally, but I think that you can see already that that's an area where we think there's an awful lot of work to be done. Remember also that number for affordability is for the population as a whole, for the average, national average. That is terribly for for lower income households. So we'll take a closer look at those when we come to it. The national picture, when we look at it across states and territories and the country as a whole, also sort of shows some divergence, but maybe not quite as much as we see across the sort of social landscape. You can see that Australia's digital inclusion has improved steadily and significantly since our data started in 2014, and that a lot of these states are really travelling at around the same sort of level. We've got the ACT as leading the pack as it has done since we started with 67.5. Tasmania is coming last here with 59.6. The other states pretty much are all around the sort of same kind of level. And when you look at how they've travelled over time, you'll see that that they've moved around a little bit, but they're all sort of they're all grouped fairly closely together. Some of the strongest improvements among the states and territories since we started in 2014, we've seen from Victoria and South Australia. But as you can see right now, most of those are fairly tightly bunched, with the ACT and Tasmania being the exceptions. See this again, just how close a lot of these states and territories are in this chart. But what you can also see there is the gap between metropolitan Australia and rural Australia. So still a very significant difference there in levels of digital inclusion. And you can see also just how the ACT and Tasmania stand out as well. If you look at the social and economic landscape of the country and how digital inclusion is distributed across that, I think you can see some starker differences. And these are areas we've looked at quite closely as we've gone along. So that dotted line across the middle of this chart, or towards the top of it, that's the Australian average. That's our overall national outcome. So you can see how, looking at that chart from left to right, the differences in the income quintiles, what difference does it make from being in the top quintile for household income to the fifth? Very, very significant. You can see that the lowest scoring groups across for our results in this year remain those that we've identified in the past. The lowest quintile for income, those who are with less than secondary education, and that 65 plus age group remain the lowest scoring groups for digital inclusion. There are some really stark differences here. They reflect very, very different outcomes. So we'll come to these, but if in relation to income, they're really clear. Digital inclusion declines very steeply with household income. As you can see, those outcomes for the quintiles 4 and quintiles 5 are very substantially below what we see higher up. A lot of this, of course, is to do with those affordability measures that we're interested in. In quintile 5, we find households that might be spending around 4% of their household income on connections to the internet. If you're in quintile 1, that figure might be less than 1% of your income. So what that will equate to, when we look at our numbers, we assign a score for relative expenditure, which is measuring this exact thing. What proportion of your income are you devoting to this? For quintile 5, that figure is going to be 11.3. For quintile 1, it's going to be 84.9. So there are very, very substantial differences on this measure of affordability. You can see that pretty clearly in this chart, which just breaks down those different dimensions of digital inclusion across the income scales. You can see that there are differences all across the board: digital ability, access, and affordability. But that biggest gap there is the one about affordability. What does this look like over time when we look at how our numbers have tracked since our data begins in 2014? This shows you the gap between that top quintile for income and the fifth quintile, the gap in digital inclusion. And you can see that it's scarcely moved since 2014. So this is why we see this as a critical area for further intervention, policy development and initiatives of all kind in coming years, especially so in the light of the consequences of the pandemic. So I'll move fairly quickly through some of our other results across different social and economic categories. When we look at employment, we've got three basic categories there. As you can see, we're employed, unemployed, and people who are not in the labour force, so people who are not seeking employment. And you can see that there are really significant differences there. That those who are not in the labour force are scoring significantly lower, and that's particularly the case in relation to measures of digital ability, as you can see there. Turning to education, we've made distinctions between people who have a tertiary education, a secondary education, and those who've not finished secondary school. And you can see that there is a very significant gap between those who have less than a secondary education and even the Australian average. So 12-point gap there, which is really a very large one. You can see how that plays out in relation to access and affordability, but especially in terms of skills, capacities, all of those things under the general category of digital ability. That's where the very big gap there is. Looking at that again across time, we see it narrowing slightly here. So some improvement has been made, but really that's very marginal. Not as much as we'd like to see. Turning to age, and you can see here the different age brackets that we're working with in the report. And as I said earlier, when we look at that 65 plus age group, this is one of the least digitally included groups in the Australian population. And there's a very substantial difference there. So if we break that down across our three dimensions, again, you can see the pattern is slightly different, but there are very, very big gaps there in relation to digital ability in particular, but also, of course, in relation to affordability, where we're seeing a lot of people with fixed or low incomes, and internet connection makes up a significant portion of their overall budget. But there's a very big gap there in relation to digital ability, 17 points below the national average for people over 65. We're well aware of the fact that that 65 plus age group is huge. It's very diverse. There are big differences there. If you break it down a little bit further, so into different age brackets within that, you can see pretty clearly how levels of digital inclusion appear to decline as you encounter older groups, and there are substantial differences there between outcomes for that 65, 69 group, and then of course the 80 plus. The age gap is also something we're interested in. So again, this is like our earlier slides where we've looked at how this gap has tracked over time. From the point our data begins in 2014 to now, 2020, and you can see there that it's widened. So this is the gap between digital inclusion outcomes for that age 25 to 34 bracket and the 65 plus. So it's actually got larger rather than smaller over the period that we've been working with. So again, this is another area where we're not seeing the rate of improvement or the kind of improvement we'd be hoping to see. The trends are showing that we're traveling, the performance overall is very flat, or even going backwards a little bit. So to turn to some other key groups, or just looking at the Australian population in different ways, if we think about how people connect to the net, it's interesting. 20% almost of Australians are mobile-only users. That means they're connecting to the internet through a smartphone or another kind of mobile device. Around 4 million Australians. You can see there those Australians who are more likely to be in this category than others. You can see also, looking at those figures on the left there, just what a very substantial difference, 19 points, almost 20 points in our scale, there is between digital inclusion outcomes for the Australian population as a whole and those who rely entirely on a mobile connection. So we're looking at a fairly significant problem here. If you look at that across our different dimensions, again, just to break it down a little bit so you can see where the problems particularly arise, well, they're actually across all three dimensions for different reasons. Mobile-only people, mobile-only users often have access to less data than those who have fixed connections or fixed connections combined with mobile connections. So that will go to the level of access. In terms of digital ability, the fact that they have less data, they can do less things, is probably also reflected in the outcomes there. But there's a really big difference there, of course, in relation to affordability with this group, and that's simply because mobile data costs considerably more per gigabyte in general than data that you buy through a fixed broadband plan, and that has considerable constraining and knock-on effects, we think, for mobile-only users. Now, as Jules said, we also included in the report this year a couple of case studies where we were interested particularly in the impact of the pandemic on different groups of Australians, and understanding how the level of digital inclusion that people may have has changed their degree of exposure to the pandemic and the consequences of COVID-19 for different groups. So we've looked in particular at where that has left older Australians and families as well. I'll talk about families in a minute, but just to point to some of the very high-level outcomes from the work around the impact on older Australians. You can sort of see there just how significant the sorts of changes that have come about have been. Remembering the data we've just looked at, showing where that 65 and over population sits in relation to digital inclusion overall, and you can see that there are really sort of significant issues here. When we have social distancing, when we have lockdowns, when we have all those kinds of things going on, people's access to the internet is more important than ever for social connections and for access to critical services, health information, all of those kinds of things. So this is an example of the kind of dynamic that Andy was talking about, where those who are really most dependent on critical support and services, when we work through this extraordinary digital transformation, what we find is that they may be they may actually benefit least and be most exposed as a result. So big gaps there in relation to access, affordability, and digital ability, meaning that people are likely to be significantly more isolated in these circumstances and to be experiencing high levels of loneliness as a result. So these are, really substantial costs of a country where we don't have, where we have more digital exclusion than we'd like to see. And it really underlines the urgency around these issues now. Turning to low-income families, where we've found a wholly different set of challenges emerging as a result of the pandemic, but nonetheless critical problems. You can see here that this chart showing you the results across our 3 different dimensions for the country as a whole. That's the dark blue or purple bar column there on the left. Then families with school-aged children. That's the pink column. And then on the right, we've pulled out the figures for low-income families with school-aged children, because we can see that they've been particularly affected by recent events in different ways. The shift to homeschooling, of course, has put the onus on families to provide connections and to enable students to ensure that they have some kind of continuity with their education. We think there are about 800,000 students in this low-income family category, and we can see there that there are really huge challenges. This is where we think there is the sorts of measures that we talked about a little bit earlier, the kinds of steps that governments and some businesses have taken to make devices and connections to the internet more available for low income and vulnerable families who would not otherwise have access or adequate access to the internet and the devices they need to pursue their education and to engage with other sorts of services and connections. We think there's a real need to look at how those can be continued over time. So I hope that gives you a broad idea of the sorts of results that we're seeing out of the index for this year. It's a sobering story. It has been, as Andy said, an extraordinary time. We've had an acceleration of digital transformation, which has brought lots of benefits for people. But at the same time, you can see that it's exposed more vulnerable Australians across a whole lot of different groups and in a whole lot of different places and in a whole lot of different ways, and to significant disadvantage, which we will need to address if we're going to be able to restart the country in the way that we'd like to do. So that gives you a broad idea, I think, of the results we've seen this year. We're continuing the work as Andy and Jules said. We're wanting to develop it further to enable us to sort of take a bit of a deeper look into digital ability in particular, recognising that that's likely to be a particularly significant problem coming up in the future, and doing that in a way which will help us compare Australian outcomes, not just within Australia across the different sorts of groups we've been talking about, but also with other countries. We'd really welcome your feedback and ideas about how we use this and how we frame this research. We're so very interested in that, and of course encouraging you to look at the full report, because all I've been able to do so far is just in this short presentation today is just give you a glimpse of the main findings. There's a great deal more in there at a state and territory level, and looking at all those different groups that we've been talking about in a lot more detail. We're delighted that people are using the internet, the index as much as they are. It's really fantastic to see that, and we're thinking that we see that as providing a very, very useful sort of multiplying benefit on our knowledge about this challenging problem. So I'll leave it there, Jules, and I hope that's given people enough to ask some good questions, and we'll look forward to some useful, some stimulating discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julian. I think you've done an awesome job at pulling out and distilling with all the data some of the key highlights, and I can see in the chat room some reflections of people like Cecily talking about an awesome summary. But I'm going to try and pull out a few of the questions. We won't get to all of them, but still feel free to put them in, because we'll be able to take them later as well to try and get back to people who've asked questions. So we have available Julian, but also Joe Barraket and Chris Wilson available to answer the questions. And I thought I would start with one that I've drawn from the chat. And it really wants the perspective of does the ADII compare internationally? And so that was Loretta and Sanjay and Christopher were all interested to hear how that operates.
Maybe I can make a few comments on that. Well, I mean, a few things to know. One is really that the index itself is an individual measure of digital inclusion for individuals. There are a lot of international indexes available, and the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, has been heavily involved in developing those. Many of them include much more kind of abstract concepts around infrastructure development, government policy towards telecommunications, and of course that goes beyond that individual level. So we've, in some ways there are international rankings of nations in terms of digital inclusion and the digital divide, but many of them, as I say, use these kind of multiple types of measures rather than just an individual framework. We think the individual framework is really useful. It tells us, I think, a lot more about what people are actually experiencing on the ground. Of course, we would love to see the sort of research that we're doing here rolled out so that we could have some international benchmarks. We are doing some work over the next few years in which we have done some sort of comparative work around particularly the skills area, and we may have some sort of findings that at least provide us some kind of international comparative basis over the next few years. So I guess look towards that, but in terms of a sort of individualised DI study, there isn't really a comparable model.
Yeah, and thanks, Chris. And maybe talking about sort of the future, as you were there, in terms of what we might see. Maybe I could just hand to you, Julian, in terms of one of the questions that had come through was if you could please speak to the future survey tool, and basically at the particular interest of Danielle was around how that tool might be used to address some of the to get richer data in relation to remote Australian communities as well.
Oh, look, thanks. And it really is a critically important area. I think what we're looking at doing is developing perhaps a more complex array of questions around what people can do online and understanding that a bit better. Being able to understand that a bit better in context. The other thing that we're doing, which I think will make a really significant difference here, and we're learning from our experience with this. I mean, as you know, from looking at our earlier reports, we've looked at digital inclusion more closely over the years in a couple of remote Indigenous communities, and we've learned a lot from that experience. So one thing that we really want to be able to do is to make the index as usable as possible and as adaptable as possible. So I think in your comment, Daniel, you mentioned the need for this kind of evidence base, particularly in relation to Indigenous communities with the Closing the Gap commitments that have emerged. That's a really critical need. What I think that we can do is provide a basis for that work, if we're asked to do so, with the developed approach that we have. But we've always understood that in relation to those communities, you are always going to need a much more fine-grained data collection process than we have been able to do on a nationwide level with the level of resourcing that we've had up till now. So the opportunity is there to do it. I think we're better now, and we've learned a fair bit. We're looking forward to being involved in this if we can be, because it's a very challenging and significant area, but it does need close attention. I don't think it's something we would do just as part of this overall research project. It really needs to be a dedicated effort, but one which is connected to this work so that the results are comparable and usable in a similar way.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Look, I think we've got time for at least one more question, and I might actually direct this to Joe Barraket, and it's one from Louisa. This is more your perception or your perspectives in terms of what interventions would make a positive and significant difference, in your view, to digital inclusion in Australia?
So it's such a good question, and multiple people have asked it, and there's a lot of excellent ideas in the chat function as well. But I'm just going to go slightly off script for a second and say, as a sociologist, we need to improve socioeconomic equality. That is clearly the underpinning, structural issue that is informing a whole lot of different forms of exclusion, including digital inclusion, and hence we see the patterns between typical patterns of social inclusion and digital inclusion. Now, that doesn't, I'm certainly not suggesting that that means that there's no responsibilities for telcos, for government investing into digital participation, etc. But we, at a systems level, we need to fix that. The other thing, I guess, that we don't talk about in relation to the index, because our measurement is of people and households, is the inequalities between sectors. And the not-for-profit sector, broadly speaking, and the community sector in particular, really, along with local government, is the civic infrastructure of Australia. And particularly for community organisations, they're pretty digitally excluded too. So, without wanting to disregard work of organisations like Info Exchange and Connecting Up, there needs to be significant investment into and work to support community sector participation and digital inclusion, so that they might better serve the most disadvantaged members of the community that they typically do.
Thanks, Joe. I feel like we could squeeze one more in terms of before 3 o'clock. I'll make sure my final notes are short. So to our researchers again, this is particularly from Kate Rowe, and it's about the mobile-only users. And her interest was, has the ability of those mobile-only users been tracked over time? For example, thinking if someone only has mobile access, are there prospects for employment, education, etc. affected, and how do people improve their ability if they're in that low ability group?
Chris, do you want to talk to that one?
Sure. Look, I mean, of course, we have measured their the level of digital inclusion overall for that group in the data set from 2014. I mean, I think the issue with that mobile-only group, I mean, it is a very, very complex one, because we've seen sort of changing technologies, changes to the interfaces, changes to the things you can do on mobile devices. So there is a sort of sense in which that landscape kind of is kind of evolving. And we've seen, things like sort of tablets that now come with keyboards and things that sort of shift into this mid-ground of what's mobile and what's fixed in terms of at least the device area. I mean, I think that's a real area for, kind of much more qualitatively based research. I mean, we can identify, and I think the index is fantastic at identifying avenues for exploration where we really need people to use the index as a sort of launching tool then to get into do some of that deep research, which necessarily involves a much more close human interaction in terms of, looking at sort of types of behaviours, the way people are looking at and using devices in very specific ways. So, I mean, I guess that's my kind of overall perspective on the index. A lot of people, and it's great in the questions, people have a lot of questions about the index and what the index can tell us. It's a fantastic diagnosis tool. It says these are the things that are going on over time. We may need to look at these things in a lot more detail and then design interventions that can actually address very, very specific needs. So I guess I'm not trying to wriggle out of my answer here on mobile only, but I do think it is an avenue for further investigation in terms of how that does impact on people's use and the benefits they get from being online.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that, Chris. And look, I might draw to a close then the time that we have together. I know we could go on much more and dive deeper, but it's a little bit like what the index itself is. It's for us, and our involvement at Telstra is very much to help raise the quality of the discussion and the informed debate to help inform policy and action. And sometimes that means more effort, deeper research, but other times it means we can act on what we see and what we read here. So thank you so much for our researchers, for Julian, Joe and Chris joining us today, and for Andy. Thank you, Andy, for joining us today at this launch. And thanks to everybody who's actually come online to join as well. Hopefully you can access the data and look at ways that you can use that more in your work world. I want to have special thanks particularly to, in our Telstra team, Abby Bryden, who has been tireless and in her dedication to bringing this data to the table for people's use, and together with yourself, Chris, from the Centre of Social Impact at Swinburne, a particular call out of thanks. For all of our participants today, I hope you found the snapshot into the information interesting and the answers to the Q&A. And you will have seen the links in the chat to where you can download the full index. Hope it opens up further conversations for your organisation, and would love you to continue conversations with us as well. So thanks for joining very much on all of our behalves, and please stay safe and well. Bye.